Oh, good morning again. This is Russell Rucker. I'm here for another constitutional talk. Every week we have these talks, and I ask you to subscribe. I, you know, I think it's important because we need to discuss things, and there's a lot of things to talk about. And I know everybody isn't always interested in the historical aspect of things. But in my view, the Constitution matters because of what they went through to get it. Now, a month or so ago, we were discussing Paul Reveres and Dawes and Mr. Prescott as they rode out of Boston and warned that the British were coming by sea. They finished their ride, and it got to be close to dawn, and the guys that had gathered at Burns Tavern over off of Lexington came out of the tavern, and their leader ordered them to assemble at Parade Rest. See, they had no indication that the British would actually fire upon them, because they had come out of the city before and nothing had ever occurred. But on this morning, they lined up on the green. The redcoats came on up. There was a group of onlookers off to the side along the road. And the leader of the redcoats drew his sword, and he charged up like this, approached the militiamen, the Minutemen, and he told them to drop your weapons and disperse. Now, they were a little slow at doing this. They weren't prepared. They weren't going to leave their weapons, so they started moving off a little bit, and that's when the rest of them. That's when the rest of the redcoats charged them, and they fired. And that's when it all began. And the redcoats ran about going into people's houses and searching homes, and at that point, their drummer was ordered to call recall. And once he got control of the unit back, they began their march back down the road towards Concord and their thoughts of the weapon stores. So they get down is when they decide, this has gotten a little more intense than we believe. They had run across, messengers and this kind of thing, and they knew there were people out there, and they'd lost the element of surprise. So he sent a man back to Boston asking for reinforcements, and he traveled back to Boston, basically the same route that Dawes had taken all the way back. They get back there, and he does send reinforcements out. The redcoats march down into Concord, and they go down towards the South Bridge, and they're kind of searching around town, and a group of them are disbanded to go across to a farm, I think it's Barrett's farm, across the North Bridge and searching, because that's where they believe the weapon stores are kept. So they go over across the bridge, and they begin searching the farmhouse. The militiamen, as they approached the town, they crossed the South Bridge, and they went across up onto a high point. And it takes a little while for them to finish their search at the farmhouse. And all the while, they're gaining more militiamen, because the call has come out, and they're coming. They just keep coming, and their numbers keep growing. So the militia sees something going on down in the town. They see some kind of fire happening. And what had happened was Down along the South Bridge, they had cornered someone and demanded that they tell them where these weapon stores were. And they managed to uncover some artillery units and a few cannon. So they destroyed that. And that's when they came down from the hill. And at seeing the militiamen coming, the Redcoats actually backed up. They came back across the bridge on the Boston side of the bridge, and they started lining up along that creek bed they had there, or river. So they're lined up along there, and one of the British fires above their heads. That's when the militia started firing, and they're firing on both sides. Men are falling, but most of the rounds fall into the river, harmless. But they back up a little further into town. And it's about this time that the Redcoats decide they're going to abandon their search of the farm across the North Bridge. And they come back into town, they start encountering dead soldiers laying around, and they're shocked at what's happened. And they start heading back. The militia crosses the South Bridge and is heading back, chasing them and firing. Now, these soldiers only were given 36 rounds each to begin with. And so they didn't have a lot of ammunition. Well, about this time, the reinforcements are coming out of Boston down through Roxbury and Brooklyn and heading up to cross the Cambridge Bridge. The problem, and they didn't bring any wagons because they thought it would impede their trip. So they get up to the bridge, and the colonists have taken the planks out of the bridge to slow them down. But eventually they get across, and they get over on the east side of Lexington, and they set up their cannons and their equipment, and they're guarding, waiting for the troops to come back. The troops are racing down the highway, heading back to Lexington, and they're being closely followed and being shot at, just steady. They reach the reinforcements, and they just collapse before the reinforcements. The Redcoats fire rounds of cannonball shot above their head, trying to disperse the crowd. And they're all at that point, they're all in a running retreat, going back towards Boston. Meanwhile, you have other militiamen units coming down. The whole countryside is awash, and more keep coming. They're hiding behind stone walls and trees, and as the British continue to retreat, they just keep shooting and shooting and shooting at them. And many are wounded, a few get killed, but for the most part, they're just in fear for their life. That first group that went out, they're pretty well out of ammunition by now. They don't have any resources. And they're chased all the way back to Charlestown, which is where they originally crossed the river, and they've got some warships out there waiting for their return. You get more and more militia coming in. They get back into Boston. The militia surrounds the bottleneck and all around Boston, and they put Boston under siege. Boston stays under siege for 8-9 months anyway. It's close to a year before the siege is ended. I think it's in February or March of the following year before the siege actually ends. But the shot heard around the world was way back in Concord, when they were on different sides of the river. And those shots from the Minutemen coming back into the British, that was the shot heard around the world. The British were shocked at the level of people and the numbers that they had coming out of the woods to shoot at them. Just thought you'd like a little more information on what exactly happened that day. And I know a month or so ago we talked about Revere and the warning going out to Concord, but they came back with almost nothing. They had destroyed a few cannon, a few artillery, and captured a few pieces of artillery, but they'd lost just about everything on the way back. And they were shot up for sure. And this is the very beginning of our conflict. We get into then the siege of Boston. And soon enough, by the end of the siege, you've got the Continental Congress in place. And they're working on the Olive Branch Petition, and they're working on the Declaration of Independence. By the time the siege is over. And by then, you're into 1776. And you have Common Sense released in January of 76. It's all culminating to the Declaration of Independence, where we said enough. Just thought you'd like a little more information on how that worked, how it went about, and we'll talk to you next time. The next Constitutional Talk. You guys have a good day. Thank you very much. Bye.